and madly teach. Mortimer Smith. Chapter 4. The Schools as a Reflection of the Spirit of the Times. The spirit of the times is one of those large and somewhat oratorical phrases that should be used guardedly. There have been periods in history, I suppose, when there has been no unifying principle at work in society which could be called the spirit of the times, especially in those twilight periods when a dominant philosophy was on the wane and a rival philosophy in the ascendancy. There have been, on the other hand, historical epochs that we recognize as having been marked by a definite spirit and a unique outlook. One of the most famous, of course, was the 13th century in Europe, the great flowering time of the religious spirit. And another was what we call roughly the Age of Elizabeth in England, dominated by a universal spirit of discovery and commercial adventure. Can our own age be said to exhibit distinctive points of view, habits of thought, or philosophical attitudes to a degree great enough to constitute a spirit of the times? I'm not prepared to make any sweeping generalizations about the matter, but it does seem to me that there are two rather obvious tendencies present in our contemporary world which make our own times somewhat unique. We live in a period when the concept of the importance of the individual has been largely replaced by the concept of the social, and when it is widely believed that all personal and social problems can be resolved by use of the scientific method. These two tendencies are in evidence in much current thinking, and especially in our thinking about educational matters. The importance and the unique value of the individual, which is an idea inherited from the teachings of Christ in Christian theology, has always been a cornerstone of modern Western thought. Most of the great 19th century social philosophers conceived of society not as an entity or organism in itself, but as the aggregate sum of all individual action and interaction. They would agree with Toynbee, who says, "A society is a product of the relations between individuals, and these relations of theirs arise from the coincidence of their individual fields of action. This coincidence combines the individual fields into a common ground, and this common ground is what we call a society. If this definition is accepted, an important though obvious corollary emerges from it. Society is a field of action, but the source of all action is the individuals composing it." In developing this definition, Toynbee also quotes Bergson to show that social progress is not something that takes place of itself. Society leaps forward when it has allowed itself to be convinced, or at any rate, allowed itself to be shaken, and the shake is always given by somebody. Human society in this respect, as Toynbee suggests, is unlike the static social life of gregarious animals or insects, where abnormal members of the swarm or hive or pack are harried to death by the rank and file. This happens also in human society. Witness the long roll of martyrs, but not invariably. In this exception lies the difference between men and animals, and also whatever hope there be for mankind. Sometimes the herd allows itself to be convinced. Sometimes the abnormal member shakes and gets away with his shaking. Bergson was thinking of the mystic and the seer when he spoke of societies being convinced or shaken into progress by individuals, but his idea is equally true on a more mundane level. Advances in scientific and industrial research and discovery, exploration and development of new lands, all new and experimental procedures necessarily take place within a social milieu, but they are brought about only by individual action and initiative. Since the beginnings of civilization, man has accomplished much in spite of the static society around him. But the greatest periods of creative accomplishment occur when society is in a dynamic, not a static state. Society is in a dynamic state when there is present an atmosphere of freedom That is, when individuals feel they can think, investigate, and act free of all arbitrary pressures. The healthiest society is but a step removed from anarchy, a society bound together by the minimum of rules necessary to preserve order and maintain justice. This atmosphere of freedom seems especially to foster and encourage scientific and technological advance. It was no accident that the great spurt of activity in these directions during the past 150 years came after political and social freedom moved out of the abstract and into the positive stage of its development during the 19th century. Perhaps it was inevitable that much of that advance should take place in America, where there were fewer vestiges of feudal and aristocratic habits of thought to be eradicated. This conception of the individuals being the basis of society was, as I have said, the point of view from which most, at least among the Anglo-Saxons, of the social philosophers of the 19th century wrote. But another school of thought arose during this period with a different view of the nature of society. Some members of this school, ignoring the separate parts which alone comprise the whole, conceived of society as an organism in itself, or in some other fashion as having a mystic, independent existence. And while other members held less extreme views, the whole school was united in magnifying the value of social solidarity and belittling individual autonomy. If there's any unity in our discordant world of today, it consists in a devotion to this socialistic principle. There may be violent disagreements over details of the blueprint for the new world, but there is a general and widespread feeling that such a world can only be realized by narrowing the areas of individual freedom and enlarging the areas over which the authority of the social whole is supreme. As society became more and more infected with this belief in social solidarity, it was natural that the power mechanism for making it an actuality should be sought. This mechanism was found in the erection of all-powerful states, starting with Bismarckian Germany and culminating in the super-states of today. Power is something that all believers in freedom have rightfully feared. The wisest element among those who founded our American system of government believed that the healthiest society was one where power was as widely diffused as possible. Individual power can easily degenerate into evil. Collective power does so almost inevitably, whether it be the power of governments, big business, or labor unions. Niebuhr's phrase, moral man and immoral society, describes the eternal truth about power, that men alone can often be good, but men together are usually evil. Today, nothing is more obvious than the enormous consolidation of power, which has taken place during the course of the last 75 years, and nothing seems more inevitable than its further headlong progress. Though we have just fought a bloody war to eliminate power in Germany, Italy, and Japan, and seem disposed to fight another one to eliminate it in Russia, no one is naive enough to think it is power per se we want to be rid of, but only rival power. If this seems a harsh dictum, one has only to look about him and observe the actions of the so-called democracies. Although Great Britain's power in the empire sense seems definitely on the wane, she is committed at home to a policy of state control over her citizens, which would cause her great defenders of constitutional liberty to shudder were they alive today. Mr. Harold Laski, who is widely accepted in Britain as a wise social philosopher, openly suggests that the power of Parliament must be curtailed if those responsible for social and economic reforms are to have their way. The arch planner, Sir William Beveridge, speaks of essential and non-essential freedoms, the latter being those freedoms the state does not choose to recognize. And a member of the present government, the Minister of Town and Country Planning, is quoted in the press as declaring that the famed idea that, quote, an Englishman's home is his castle, unquote, is a selfish sentiment that stands in the way of people's giving of, quote, their best to the service of the community, end quote. This same spirit is in evidence in other democracies. General de Gaulle, who was looked upon in many quarters as the possible savior of French republicanism, demonstrated that you may shatter the vase, but the odor of the Führerprinzip lingers on, when he intimated in a public speech at Lille that in the future, French citizens must learn to curb the desire for independent action and subordinate themselves to, quote, those responsible for management, end quote. In America, this power philosophy has made slower progress. For our whole history from the beginning has been a protest against its implications, but the infection is gradually spreading from the old world. One evidence of impatience with traditional processes is the rise here during the last 15 years of a new political phenomenon, the government bureau, which operates largely outside the law, aggregating to itself judicial as well as executive powers. These bureaus are usually manned by a new type of civil servant, the expert planner, often an economist or a graduate of some branch of social service, who believes quite sincerely that government power must be vastly enlarged if his fine schemes for doing good to people are to succeed. Such is the corrupting influence of power that these good men often become twice as ambitious and 10 times as ruthless as an old-fashioned Tammany chieftain. One of the curious and discouraging things about the times in which we live is that the real nature of power is not recognized even by some of the best writers, Arthur Koestler as an outstanding example, who have discussed the question. While recognizing its evil effects in fascism and communism, they seem to retain a naive faith that it can be used beneficently in the democratic state. Many years ago, the great libertarian William Graham Sumner uttered a truth that our day is ignoring to its peril when he said that if the state, quote, enters as an agent into the industrial or social relations of its own subjects, it becomes the greatest and worst of all monopolies, the one best worth having under one's control, the best prize of base struggles, and the most powerful engine by which some men may exploit others, end quote. This in the article, Separation of State and Market in the Independent, February 14th, 1889. Now, the American public school system has not yet become a powerful arm of the state, despite much agitation to make it such. Control still rests with the individual states and towns, with the National Office of Education in Washington acting largely in an advisory and research capacity. With such a system of loosely organized free education, with control in local hands and with only cursory outside supervision, it is more difficult to indoctrinate all youth with uniform opinions. In the past, our schools buttressed official prejudices and currently acceptable habits of social thought, but such was the diversity in our union that these prejudices were apt to be local in nature. Although we have so far escaped any system of rigid national control, such as prevails in most European countries, our schools have not been able to escape the intellectual climate of our times. The educational reformers of the 1840s and 50s, in agitating for free schools, did so not in the cause of social solidarity, but of individual betterment. They believed that the aim of education was to produce the good individual, and that, in the aggregate, these good individuals would make the good society. That is not the atmosphere in which our educational leaders operate today. There are many evidences that what they are interested in putting across in the schools is collective virtues and collective ideals. Let me refer you, for example, to Schools for a New World, the 1947 yearbook of the American Association of School Administrators. a powerful and influential body that does much to set the tone of our school system. If you have supposed that education is concerned with developing the highest capabilities of the individual as an individual, that it is concerned with self-realization, these educators will set you aright. The unavoidable choice in education, we learn, quote, is between the primacy of the individual and the society of which he is a part, end quote. These gentlemen leave no doubt as to which side they are on. Unreserved priority must be given to, quote, the unity and well-being of our society as a whole. This means, quote, a fundamental shift in emphasis throughout our whole educational program, from helping to educate the individual in his own right to become a valuable member of society, to the preparation of the individual for the realization of his best self in the higher loyalty of serving the basic ideals and aims of our society, end quote. It seems also that the dynamic conception of the individual's worth, quote, places the emphasis on his functional significance in our society, end quote. And then the authors show they understand that only consolidation of power can overthrow individualistic education by insisting that in the future there must be, quote, a vast stepping up of the functions of government on all levels, end quote. This again from Schools for a New World, Washington, D.C., from the American Association of School Administrators, 1947. I hesitate to use the term because of its jingoistic associations, but using it in its best sense, these statements may be justly called un-American. If there is such a thing as the American idea, doesn't it consist in the thought that individuals do have primacy, and that social groupings in the state exist only for the purpose of serving individuals? And hasn't our whole history from the founding of the country until recent times been a living protest against the higher loyalty and the stepping up of government functions? That these statements can be made by a group of educators responsible for the administration of our public schools and apparently occasion no shock or surprise is one more evidence of how far we have traveled along the road to totalitarianism. It has always seemed to me somewhat ironical that educators of the type mentioned above should taunt advocates of individualistic education with the cry of authoritarianism, which is more nearly an education of authority, one that maintains that man should deliberately and freely adopt his own individual values, or one that says he must adjust his individual preferences to the values of the social group. Education of the latter type weakens the initiative and independence of the individual, subjects him to the irrational prejudices of current social tendencies, and renders him ripe for control and manipulation by the state. Emerson's dictum that nothing in the end matters save the integrity of one's own soul is replaced by the higher loyalty to group or state. Man is reduced from a free agent to a robot. There is a peculiar confusion in public school education today, which arises from the fact that educators have permitted themselves to be buffeted about by winds of doctrine which do not blow in the same direction. While they have been insisting on freeing the child's personality by lessening the pressure of the individual authority of the teacher, they have been exalting the authority of the social mass. By so doing, our schools are helping as much as any institution among us to produce automatons ripe for exploitation by clever and unscrupulous men, politicians, movie magnates, labor leaders, newspaper publishers, men who recognize and take advantage of the new herd instinct for uniformity. I have stressed individualism so constantly throughout this book that I trust no careless reader will misinterpret my meaning and conclude that I hold to some archaic and unreal conception of the individual as a completely free agent existing in a vacuum. Man is a social creature, and his life assumes meaning only in the flux of social relationships. One of the aims of education, therefore, is to teach man how to adjust himself to community living. But modern education tends to make this one aspect of education the most important one, and it is not. The most important aspect is just that intellectual and moral development of the person as a person, which these educators believe is now outmoded. If one is looking for a prescription for the spiritual illness of our time, I think it can be found in a reaffirmation of the idea so finely worded by Jacques Maritain, that, quote, the group attains its goal only by serving man, and by realizing that man has secrets which escape the group, and a vocation which is not included in the group, unquote. This from Education at the Crossroads by Jacques Maritain, page 15. I come now to the second thing which I have said is characteristic of contemporary life, the widespread belief that all our problems, personal and social, can be solved or at least ameliorated by recourse to the scientific method. The argument here is that if we would study human and social relationships without prejudice and without preconceived philosophical religious notions about the nature of man, if we could ask questions fearlessly and seek the answers and then revise all previous assumptions in the light of our new findings, in other words, if we would employ the same methods of experimentation and research as does the worker in the physical sciences, then we could make the same marvelous advances in social relationships which have resulted from the employment of this method in technology and natural science. A prime requisite for the adoption of a genuine social science, we are told, is the abandonment of those moral absolutes and metaphysical notions of truth, which, we are led to believe, are burdens that have weighed down the backs of men and prevented them from standing erect as free and emancipated beings. Not until we get rid of the idea of truth as being ultimate and absolute, we are further told, and learn to regard it as a term to be applied to what is currently workable. Not until we acknowledge that morality, in the words of Sidney Hook, quote, depends for its sanctions upon its beneficent fruits in social and personal life, end quote. Not, in other words, until we adopt a thoroughgoing pragmatic attitude shall we begin to face the problems of social living realistically and with some hope of resolving them. The point of view of the typical social scientist is cogently stated in a recent essay by the sociologist George A. Lundberg titled, Can Science Save Us? 1947. Mr. Lundberg magnanimously tells us that it is all right for us to escape the cares of the day by indulging ourselves with philosophy, religion, music, and poetry, as long as we distinguished between fact and fable, the practical and the fantastic. But truth is to be found elsewhere, in the physical and social sciences, which will be, quote, to an increasing degree the accepted point of reference with respect to which the validity, truth, of all knowledge is gauged, end quote. The social scientist is compared to the honest physician working out a painstaking diagnosis, while the social idealist is declared to be blood brother to the snake oil practitioner, promising a quick and painless cure. And there seems to be no limit to the social good that will ensue if only we let the painstaking scientist have his way. According to Mr. Lundberg, he can show us how to turn our children into socially approved citizens, how to predict the probable relative degrees of happiness in marriage, how to devise tax programs which will yield with a high degree of mathematical certainty whatever revenue is desired, how to determine what the masses want and develop the techniques for satisfying those wants, and how to determine the outcome of the next election. How is this sleight of hand to be performed? It seems that the social scientist has invented for the purpose some instruments called standardized tests, schedules, statistical devices, etc., which are still fairly crude because this is a new science, but Mr. Lundberg suggests that when the boys really get going, they will invent some humdingers. The major social problems of the day are going to be solved by the use of these instruments of precision in hands that do not shake with fear, with anger, or even with love." End quote.